delight to be here, and I thank you all for being here. Today I'm going to be a two-fisted clicker. So, I'll tell you a little bit about NCDCS. So, we're a for-profit entity. And that way, I don't have to worry about what the IRS is going to say. Right. So that makes it real interesting, a lot of fun, and I have the freedom and liberty to talk freely, not only about our history in that, but also if it came down to candidates and all of that, I have the freedom to do that as well. The Tale of Two Constitutions comes about from a very interesting perspective that I'll describe in a moment, but I have to ask you to your indulgence and some forgiveness. There's many of you out here that have taken a number of constitutional classes. Some have been legislators. Some are actively involved in either city councils or other representative positions. So you know a lot. And your perspective on what you know, I'm going to challenge tonight. I'm going to challenge you in a number of different areas. So I ask your indulgence and forgiveness that if I take you and begin to stretch you further than what you've thought you've known before, that's okay, because I'm going to bring you back again. And we're going to talk about some things that have some real action items and opportunities. And, with that, I'm glad you're here to take in 15 hours of material in the next 5 hours we have together. We don't have 5 hours together? All right, we'll do what we can in the next hour and a half. So, as some say, you can drink everything in, but there's others that are going to ignore it. You've experienced this in all different ways in life. So what's this all about? What's happening? What are we doing this evening? Well, what we're going to talk about, what do I mean by the Tale of Two Constitutions? What are the two constitutions that we're discussing? What's the whole idea of covenant to constitution? You see, our founders understood what covenant was all about. They knew that. And that was some of the things that formed their thinking in the long run. The whole idea, again, is, what's a quick overview of the framing? You know the Constitution. You've studied it. You know what it's all about. So we're going to go through that real fast. And then what happened? And why were the anti-federalists right? Why did I say they're correct? It's interesting. And then, how do we return to liberty? You see, folks, what coalesced our founders was that whole idea of liberty. What was that all about? And then I got to give you some action items. If you just get filled up with information, what good is that if you can't take something away and go do something with it? Well, I always also believe to give credit where credit is due. In my involvement with the Thomas Jefferson Center for Constitutional Studies, Dr. Kimber was Cleon's, or still is, Cleon Skousen's son-in-law. And so I worked with him on a number of different activities and projects in that. And in one of his presentations in seminar number 3 on the healing of America, he talks about the Constitution as it was and the Constitution as it is. And I said, Glenn, why don't we just call it the Tale of Two Constitutions? He goes, brilliant, let's do that. So he added that name into what he's been doing. And then in doing the research, I find out that David Barton wrote about it in 2009. He wrote about this whole thing in A Tale of Two Constitutions from the federal judiciary perspective. And he defined that. So the terminology isn't anything new, but the way that I'm going to take you down the road is going to be very interesting. So the whole idea of covenants, where did that come from? Where did that begin with? Well, there was a lot of things that people understand, and those that are attendees in church can look at it from a biblical perspective. But also, historically, when you do the research on covenants, there was this whole thing about the suzerain relationship. What was it when someone was conquered? What type of relationship was instituted? And it was either one of two different directions. One, where it was mutual, or one is where the conqueror instituted something over the people. So it was the whole idea of covenant coming together. And you can see it very, very clearly in a biblical perspective. And those that have studied the Bible will see, especially in the Old Testament, there's a lot of relational aspects that happen from God's determination on what should occur between that relationship with man and himself. The interesting, folks, that really got a lot going from our foundational perspective too was during the Scottish Reformation and then the Scottish Covenanters. They brought that whole idea, and that's what came over with the Puritans in the 1600s, was that whole idea that God was over everything. It was a transcendent relationship. So they talked about that, and that was the intent. Then it came down to compacts and what those compacts were. So when we started looking at that whole idea of what were the various relationships back with the king, it all came under that idea of compact, and what were the charters then that each of the colonies had. And they were established as a compact covenant relationship. And that's what really ticked off a lot of the founders, were the idea that their compacts, their charters were being revoked. And they saw that as a direct relationship with the king. So that really upset them. And that started a lot of different things happening. So with it, one of the things you can take, and you can look at some people smarter than me, that greater studies on this, a guy by the name of Gary DeMar and another gentleman came up with this model that can be applied to any form of government. And these 5 questions you can look at any level of government. Who's in charge? Who's got it? Who do I report to? What are the rules? How does that fit? What happens if I obey him or don't obey him? What's going on with that relational thing? And then, does the outfit have a future? Does the government, is it sustainable based on how it's going to relate to the people and its constituents? So, what we're crying out for, and everywhere that I've spoken across this country, I hear everybody saying, you know what? I want our senators to stand on the Constitution. You're saying that to, Murray and, what's the other one? Yeah, can't do well. You're saying that to the young lady that's number 4 in Congress. What's her name? That's right. And so you're telling them, stand on the Constitution. Well, folks, they are. They absolutely are standing on the Constitution as it is. And I'm going to talk to you about that a little bit as we go here. So what we're saying is that the conversation we just had, many Americans, you know about the Constitution, you understand it, really. But do you understand that full intent? What was it? What does it really mean? What happens then because we have these different ideas? We see all this different contention. In this room, already I've had conversations that we disagreed. But yet in the fundamental content of the document, we say we all agree. But we have to come to, what's been going on with it? So there was this character that showed up. There's a lot of people that will disparage the French in modern times. But how many have heard of de Tocqueville? A good number of folks have heard of de Tocqueville. And what he wrote, he came here to study what? The penal system in America and try and figure out, why is it you don't have a lot of prisons or a lot of people in prisons? Well, he came to this clear understanding that it was, wait a minute, religion and liberty were so tied in America, even when he came over in the 1830s, that it was still very much glued in an essence of who we were and represented as a people, how we interacted. He continued to say, and you'll have to excuse me when I get a little dry, he talked also about this difference in democracy and socialism and all of that. And it all comes down to this idea of equality. What's equal about anything? It's how it's executed. It's how do we take and we make that happen. What? In a democratic or in a republic, because he was looking at it from a democratic perspective, he said it's all based in liberty. But in the other, it's all about servitude. So the other thing that he observed is that liberty can't be established without morality, and with that, without faith. So it has, again, all of that time. These are the observations that he made of America at the time. But then this was an interesting one, and has no relevance today whatsoever. When Congress does what? Well, it can figure out how it can bribe you with what? Your own money. Thank you. It's nice having the dry cold, too. De Tocqueville also set the stage on a number of these different areas and the different points that he brought out on how a ruling group could take and put their arms around the people, how to grasp a hold of them, how to take and manipulate them and maneuver them and compel them, but in a way that you don't think that's happening. And when it comes right down to it, they're taking and they're, working you in a way that you're constrained, but yet not encumbering you in chains yet. And then what happens is they treat you as what? A flock of industrious animals, which the government is what? The shepherd. You see, sheeple was something that de Tocqueville, he coined that whole term. He came up with it before anybody else in modern times even thought about it. So we have that whole idea. Well, that's all interesting. It sets an interesting stage. But let's just quickly go through the Constitution as we know it. What? We understand that our rights come from God, very simply, and that the Puritan Fathers, they studied a lot of different stuff. The interesting book that I liked was what Rutherford wrote on Rex Lex. You see, it talks about in there that all of especially those early founders, what they understood about that was the idea of a minor magistrate. What you had was they were talking about the idea that your minor magistrates, your sheriffs, your city councils, your counties, or even what we would consider at our state levels, when we saw, or they saw, that the king, the parliament, was out of order and wasn't following the principles of liberty, that the minor magistrates had the right, and he did it from a biblical perspective, they had the right to counter the king and the parliament and to force them to change and to return the rights to the people. So it's a very interesting discourse. Another gentleman there, John Adams, he turns around and talks about this is what Sidney and even Locke based all of their writings and ideas on. So these guys were studied on a lot of different stuff. Does anybody know about Algernon Sidney? Has anybody heard of Algernon Sidney? Algernon Sidney was so intense in standing up against the king and the idea of the divine right of the king that he was actually thrown out of England. He was during that period of Cromwell. And then when he came back and the new king came onto the throne, he still stood up and wrote against the king to the extent that he stood on his principles and values to that point of losing his head. That was Algernon Sidney, willing to stand up on principles and values over anything else. And he paid a dear price for it. For liberty. And sets the example in his writings for us. Government derives its power from the people. And we have all of these other, Locke and the various other writings and history and just generally, these guys studied stuff. It was very intense for them that built towards that whole Constitution. What did that mean? It all developed out of the Declaration of Independence. So we know that was our first foundation. That set the foundation for us. Then the question comes to you, what's our first Constitution? Articles of Confederation. Absolutely. I'm glad I didn't have to give you the hint. But who was the first president? Anybody a Swede from a Swedish background? John Hanson was the first president under the Articles of Confederation. Even Madison. Some people say, oh, that wasn't a constitution. Even Madison says in the Federalist Papers that it was a constitution. So they understood it as that. Did it have problems? Yes. Were there some things in there that were very unique and powerful? Absolutely. So we had the Articles of Confederation, was our first form of government that took a long time to take and get ratified, but it was our first form of government that actually Samuel Adams helped write while John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were writing the Declaration of Independence. The Articles of Confederation were being written because they knew they had to have some kind of government in place as they were taking and separating from England. Our founders created this charter with the Constitution of do's and don'ts. Quite different than came about out of the Articles of Confederation. But no matter what, George Washington said, you know what? In my paraphrase, you're playing with fire. The whole thing about government is exactly that. It's just like that. Be careful. Watch how you be watchful with it all. I had to go back and in my studies, I looked at the Articles of Confederation, and I really had to say that I liked Article 6 and 9, because they were very explicit in the do's and don'ts. And it really defined the states, what they could do, couldn't do, and set into effect what the rest of that federal format was all about. Well, the framers in the Constitution came out to what? 20 delegated powers. And then, as we all know that have studied it, Madison says what? That this is limited within the context of the federal, but that the states, had all the rights. And we were talking with someone, I was just talking with someone earlier, yourself, I believe, that was, people don't understand that. The state legislatures necessarily don't understand what they have as sovereign rights within the context of the states. So there was a lot there, and that was very interesting arguments of Madison within the context of the Federalist Papers as well, when that was being challenged by the Anti-Federalists. Well, there was this idea that Samuel Adams looked at, and this was after the Articles of Confederation were ratified. And during that process, because they were ratified in 83, and he's sitting there and writing, and he's going, look, Noah Webster, we have to understand that if we're going to empower a government to do something, they have to be able to execute it. So the same was true, and he was arguing that that whole substantiation of what a government should be able to do has to be derived from the power of the people, but at the same time, we have to keep a watchful eye on what's going on. And it's the responsibility of us as individuals, not given to the legislature to watchful eye, not only in the state, or the congressperson or the senator to watch what's happening in the federal. No, the government was based on a populist notion that we, as it says somewhere else, we the people are responsible for maintaining our liberties. Well, Mr. Adams continued after the ratification of the present Constitution, or as it was submitted at that time to the states, as it came out of 87. And he started talking about a lot of different things about, again, the adequacy of the powers. He started looking at the whole idea of understanding what a true Federalist would understand and how that would work. And to take and define that, we're looking at what's going on with the human mind. So he sets up some warnings again. And he starts looking at that. Because just a little hint up front. You see, when I looked at everything that the Federalists were saying and what was happening in the convention, they really expected, in my opinion and deduction, is that the churches would do their job and we would always have a moral and virtuous people. Whereas the Anti-Federalists came by, and there's Samuel Adams being an Anti-Federalist, he says, no, you don't have to understand the nature of man, and you're always going to go after power. So when you start giving somebody some power, what are they going to want? They're going to want more power. So we have to have that watchful eye, and it has to be with the people. So what we're going to now look at is the framing of the Constitution as it was. You see, Article 1, real simple. Just real quick, real simple. What we have going on here is what? The Senate is to take care of the states. That was very simple. It was brought together. And the House was to take care of and come from and represent the people. So we're taking care of those rights and ensuring that we had some definite checks and balances. Folks, I want to tell you that in the presentation, it's documented on the website. Everything that is in the slides, all of the documentation for that is on the website as well, so you can go look at it for yourself. So with Article 1, what we now have is we have that first frame being put on the Constitution, the legislature. So then we move on to what's next. Article 2, very simple. Gives the president what? Defines what he's supposed to do, how to administer it. He has no authority whatsoever to do what? Make law. He can't do that. He can't do it on his own. So what's that mean? So this gentleman, the pseudonym Cato, he was writing as an anti-federalist, and he started talking about this whole idea that all magistrates, great, no matter who they are, and whatever their personalities are going to be, you start putting them in power for an extended period of time, they're going to get real used to this, and They're going to get settled in it. They're going to want more. They're going to start accumulating people around them that will favor them. And what's it going to happen? It's going to get down to the whole point that it costs you the citizenry. It costs us the citizenry. So they were really talking about not only how long a president should be in power, but what could happen when he starts having all of these other types of people that favor him or are promoting their ideas. So there was a lot of interesting warnings and conversations that were going on about this. Excuse me. So the 6 duties of the president, we know this. This is very simple. You know, he's a chief of state. He takes and he's a commander-in-chief over the military. He's a chief executive officer over the executive branches. And again, when we look at what was in Article 1, that was limited as far as what the executive branches were supposed to be, how they functioned, what they did. He was a chief diplomat, and excuse me, he was the architect of perceived needs. And so he could take and submit ideas for bills and legislation on the perceived needs, but then it was all relative to what the Congress was able to discern and the states, what they said that they would agree on. And then he was supposed to be the conscience of the nation. He was supposed to be able to take and grant pardons as he saw fit. So here we have, there it is. You got that second frame going on, the executive branch. Article 3 is the judiciary. They're what? The watchdogs. They're supposed to pay attention to what's going on and keep who? The president and the legislature within the bounds of the Constitution. That was what was intended. That was the whole perspective of the judiciary, was to look at it from that point of view. Well, what was real interesting, excuse me, I went to make sure I click. Let me go back one. I apologize. I'm double button here. John, can you take me back one? There. I want you to take a look here at that date. What is that? 1791. When was the Constitution ratified? 89. I'm not a math expert, even though I have a degree in physics. But wait a minute. How many years is that? And look what they're saying. What is going on here, folks? People were thinking in 91 that the judiciary was a branch of the executive. Wow. Wow. So they're already seeing some things happening within the judiciary in a relationship that was going on there. But Wilson, what he was saying is, no, wait a minute, what we have here, these guys are supposed to be wise, they're supposed to be principled, they're supposed to be doing the right thing, and they're supposed to be clear-headed, as we look at this. So with the judiciary, now we're getting that third frame going on to the Constitution. Looking pretty good, right? We got these frames, they're coming on. This is going well for us. Article 4 just basically builds that association between the federal government and the states with the states. So it was real interesting when I would bring this slide up in Arizona and talking about the federal government was supposed to guarantee the protection of the states, that everybody was, and because with the open borders that are there, it's just amazing. And the arguments that are going on. Well, wait a minute. Isn't Washington a border state too? My goodness. What's going on up here? We don't hear a lot about it, but I'm sure there's a lot of interesting activity going on along the border. Well, I'm sorry? FEMA. Oh, FEMA. Oh. and the 100-mile exclusion? That's right. Yeah. So it gets interesting. So what we have next then is another frame going on with the states' rights. Wow. We've got some basic, fundamental frames that just went on this Constitution. And you know what? That's pretty good. That sets some things really in motion for us. Puts it all together. What we have now is Article 5. It allows the citizenry to do what? Change the Constitution as they see fit based on what's going on, what's happening. And as we know, is that each amendment, that it becomes a part of the Constitution and supersedes any of the other amendments that it would replace, or that area within the context of the Constitution that it is amending in itself. So that's a process by which the founders had given us to say, if there's something that is going a little off balance over time, here's a method by which we can take and amend. Well, this other anti-federalist, the federal farmer in number 4, he starts thinking about that. He says, wait a minute, you get this power going, you start handing it off to different people, you get this idea of this convention. You know what? Some nefarious people could come in there and start skewing the whole idea of what this federal government is supposed to be, how it's supposed to work. And you know what? Even if you got a good idea, even if you have a really good idea on finding something that's broke and really need to fix it, you know what? They may take and say no. They may put the money, the effort, the manpower, and all of that in stopping it. But if it's something that appeals to them, if it's something that these people would think would benefit them, guess what they're going to do? They're going to try and promote it. You know what? We're going to talk about this a little bit more later. I think you'll find it very, very interesting. So with this, what we have is now a method of adding to changing the Constitution as we need it. We have it that it can either be done and derived out of Congress, which most of the amendments have been done, or it can be done by a convention of the states, which I think one of your future speakers is going to be talking about, or some one of the other locations is going to have a speaker that's going to be talking about that. And we'll kind of touch on a little bit of that a little bit later too. Article 6 is very simple. Article 6 that says that this is supreme law of the land. Period. The Constitution is supreme law of the land. But in addition to that, what you have to understand is that all treaties that are made or shall be made are also the supreme law of the land. See? They're the supreme law of the land too. And oh, by the way, you have to understand that if you're going to be elected to office, you have to take an oath to the Constitution. I took an oath 5 times. So, in my military career. So, the idea is that you take an oath to the Constitution. Well, again, our friend, the federal farmer, he came up with this whole thing. He said, whoa, wait a minute. You know what? This is going to be the last act that you people do. You see, it's not a constitution of the various states as the Articles of Confederation were. It was this idea of you over there. It's the people. It's a constitution of the people. So he talked about this a little bit differently, and he was kind of warning on some things that could happen over a period of time, and what the authority would be, especially under the idea of treaties, and who would be doing the treaties. So he argued about this a little bit and said, hey, just a warning, folks, just a warning. So that was very interesting. Article 7, ratification. You see, it took so long for the Articles of Confederation to be ratified because it required all of the colonies, then states, to ratify it. Whereas it was argued, by Madison in particular, he goes, you know what, hey, we had one state that didn't even show up for the convention. Most of the delegation in New York left, and even though they participated in it, and wanted it to some degree at the beginning on the ideas of commerce, you know what? The argument was that why should 12 suffer for 1 refusing, so they went with 9 as only necessary to ratify the Constitution. I think what's really interesting, and I don't know that you can see all of the colors, is the idea of who were the Federalists and where the population of Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists were in that. And as it is today, I think it's extremely interesting, is that the concentration of the Federalists were in the large cities, were in the most populous areas, whereas the Anti-Federalists were in some of the populous areas, but were more outlying and had more of that frontier spirit and agrarian ideas as part of their thinking. Well, we have this thing called the preamble then. What's that about? Well, the preamble was to clarify and to set into motion that idea of what's the purpose of the Constitution? How's it supposed to function? How do we get this? And it's really a declaratory clause of what is then inside the body, so that people could clearly understand just from the preamble alone, you should be able to define in broad terms how the Constitution should function. So, it's very simple. Comes out to we the people, the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, that was one, establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, we have that internal, to take and promote for the common defense and provide for the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to what? Ourselves and our posterity do establish this Constitution. Did I miss something in reading? You see, I think I read it as it's being read today, instead of the way that it was intended. You see, they intended it to provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare. So, interesting. You just flip a couple words, you know? And I think that was interesting because Madison talked about that as well. He says it's a contextual thing. That even in the arguments of what he had in the Federalist Papers, some of the things he wrote in 39, was the idea that, you know what, if you're not following the semicolon, I mean, he got down to that. How do you understand the definition of the terms and how are these things supposed to function? Wow. Well, he got to the definition of terms. Patrick Henry jumps up during the Virginia ratifying convention and says, hey, who gave you, and you know what, we have some great folks, some of the greatest folks that secured our liberty at that convention. Brilliant minds. Time out. Who gave you the right to use we the people and not we the states? You see, there was a different relational idea that was being built there. And it was a continuing definition and argument between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists as who would this government be over? Would it be over and would the states be consolidated into a single union and their rights and liberties gone away? And be directly imposed upon the people? This was a question that he had. And so it was very interesting to understand that they saw a lot of things that we're experiencing today. So with these 7 articles and the preamble, what we have now is the basic Constitution. And this is what was submitted to Congress in September of '87, and it just didn't take more than 2 years. By the time it went through all of the ratification processes of the various states, it was ratified in '89. That's fast. Whereas it took all those other many years, from 76 to basically 83, to ratify the Articles of Confederation. There was a whole wartime period. That's why they were seen as so many problems. And they argued that, boy, we have to get this thing fixed. There was this idea of expediency that was happening and that was brought forth during the convention. And the idea is that we had to fix this whole, the articles in such a way and in such a drastic way. Well, as I mentioned, there were these fellows that came about called the Anti-Federalists. They were local leaders. And interestingly was that, and I want to emphasize this, they never formed alliances across the states. They had great things to say, great ideas, but you know what? They didn't have their messaging down, even though a lot of their letters were promoted in all the various newspapers and as their writings went out. And there was one phenomenal person in here that many people don't realize was there from the beginning. This individual right here, Mercy Otis Warren. She again, she was there from the beginning. She was peers with Samuel, John Adams, Elbridge Gerry, all of the Massachusetts crowd, if you will. And she wrote some phenomenal things. And she was an anti-federalist. She wrote plays early on and talked about what was happening under the royal governorship. She was extremely supportive. And a lot of people say that Samuel Adams was the one with Benjamin Franklin that started the correspondence between the states. It was actually in the Warren home. And Mercy was the one that said, hey, you know what? Why don't we have these committees of correspondence and start bringing all of the towns together, start bringing the various colonies together and communicate what's going on. We need to have it come together on the communication. Well, without getting into all of these personalities, what we see that happened was that the Anti-Federalists really came up with this whole idea that, wait a minute, what's going on here? There's two critical things that we see in the Constitution that can have and backfire on us. First being the necessary and proper clause, and the second being the Supreme Court. You could take and render everything down that the Anti-Federalists talked about, and it'll come down to these two issues. Meaning that, what? The first will interfere with the rights of the states and the people, and the second will give the federal government just the open hand to do whatever they want to do. Very intuitive. Very intuitive. But you folks don't know anything about that. That's never happened. That's not happened at all. So with these efforts, what we then see is that we were able to get out of that not only what the enumerated powers were, but what we had was a ratification of the Bill of Rights after the first Congress came into session. How many amendments were initially offered to that first Congress? Does anybody know the number?
Over 300, I think.
Little less. There was 107. 107. So 107 amendments were what was first offered and then was rendered down. And some say to the 12. It went through the process of the 12 and came out with the 10. And there's arguments on, a couple of them, what happened to the original number 9 and all of that. So it's very, very interesting in that whole process. So what we have then is now, that framework with the Bill of Rights. Let me ask you this. Did you know that the Bill of Rights has a preamble? Are you familiar with what that preamble might say? If I may, I'm going to just take a moment to work the trumpet here. What the preamble says in here to the Bill of Rights is that the convention of a number of the states having, of the time of adopting the Constitution, expressed a desire in order to prevent misconstruction or abuse of its powers, that further declaratory and restrictive clauses should be added, and as extending the ground of public confidence in the government will best ensure the beneficent ends of its institution. Interesting. Interesting. That's what the whole idea of the Bill of Rights was all about. Was to clean up misconstrued, so things wouldn't be misconstrued and, make some additional declarations. So by 1804, and as I look to, just for your information, I kind of separate the founders from the framers based on the age category of the different participants. So what we had in 1804, we were seeing that some things were kind of going awry and determined that we needed to add a couple additional amendments. The 11th Amendment was on a state sovereignty issue because somebody was trying to sue a state, and they said, well, you can't do that, and states needed to be sovereign. So, the gist of it was that was established in that regard as the 11th Amendment. The 12th Amendment was about the president and the vice president. So what was happening at that time, many of you may know, is that the president could be of one political thought process, whereas the vice president could be of a different. So you would either have a federalist, anti-federalist, and by that time they're going, my goodness gracious, that's not really going to work in the execution of an administration, so we need to have the people of the same thought process. Therefore, the vice president and the president should have the same political mindset, or as parties were starting to become established at that period of time, that's what they decided to do and made that changes so that they would be of the same political persuasion. So as we look at this and as it was handed out and given to us then, what we now have is this Constitution that not only has that framework, we have the Bill of Rights, and we have the 11th and 12th Amendments. Ladies and gentlemen, this was the Constitution as it was given up through that period of time. What do we start seeing happening? Wow, we're going to jump back and forth a little bit in history here. But the idea it didn't take long. And things started to change from all different argumentative positions. And some of them not necessarily by amendment, but some by legislation and activity. So what we started to see, there were bank wars that were going on in the 1830s. Actually started sooner than that when Hamilton and the first bank in the United States. So we have Andrew Jackson saying, well, wait a minute, we're going to go back to what Congress should be doing as far as managing our financials system here in America. And we started seeing original intent being altered through these various courses. But you know what? In spite of it all, as we got into the 1900s, America was the fast track of success and liberty and freedom still. It was just amazing, even if we go back in time. Oh, here's an interesting one for you. Once again, down here for a second, the date, 1829. What started happening in the 1800s, in the early 1800s, was we were getting influxes of immigrants. So a number of people were starting to think that process through, and they're going, and even into the churches. And they're going, wait a minute, we need to start looking at how do we need to change? How do we need to have government do more for the people? How do we expand this idea of taking care of people? And so what was going on was that we were seeing that even inside the context of the churches, that they were moving from what they were teaching as a biblical format to what became known in that early period of time as the social gospel. And they started influencing, actually, sadly, what was happening then in the political realm. You had this character come up with this idea of, wait a minute, we need to have a whole new Declaration of Independence. And as you see in there, 1829, just amazing concepts that were coming into play. Well, I started looking at the 1860s, and many of you looking at history will say, that was really disembarking from some original intent with the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. You know, 13th Amendment was fine in what it did there. 14th Amendment, we could talk probably for a week on that. Many of you have been to different classes on the 14th Amendment and what it did. But the whole idea also in the 14th Amendment is what we saw in that state sovereignty aspect in the 11th Amendment, the way that it was judicially applied over a period of time, especially under this incorporation doctrine, which meant that they can incorporate the context of the 14th Amendment over and across the Bill of Rights, started deteriorating a lot of things. And we've seen that happen most recently when they used the 14th Amendment on the gun rights issue in Chicago. They applied the 14th Amendment as part of that. They did use the 14th Amendment in a number of different things. So there we see that the preamble to the Constitution itself is ignored, and we start seeing that the preamble to the Bill of Rights and the Bill of Rights itself becomes ignored. So in 1900, progressivism really starts coming in. The 1800s moved through that whole period. We saw it happening in a lot of different ways. Men of power and wealth were starting to take and use their influences that they were warned about. earlier in time. It was interesting that Madison made the comment that, you know what, if you take, and the safety within the context of the Constitution is the fact that you're going to, if somebody's doing wrong, you're going to take and do what? You're going to vote them out of office. Huh. One of the Anti-Federalists turns around and says, you know, that's real interesting is that in here, there's no term limits. That a person in the Senate can be reappointed over and over, or as it goes into Congress, they can be voted over and over. There's no limit as to when they should be returned, and remember whence they came from. They're very interesting that they talked about that. And they says, you know what? If people are going to give flack, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says, if people are giving flack about that person getting reelected, don't worry about it. The money interest will come in and help that person get reelected. Oh. Anti-Federalists were talking about that in 87 and 88 during that whole ratification process. Wow. Well, you know what? If you can't take and kill the message, what do? You kill the messenger. Well, that's what they started doing back in the late 1800s or early 1900s. They started disparaging and going after even the founders themselves. There's documentation that I've looked at and reviewed and researched through that shows that over $1.25 billion by 1975 was used and put in to take and make our founders look like idiots. To take and start breaking apart, disparaging the Constitution and its context and its framework. Well, I started looking even further and I'm going, wait a minute, what's going on here? We got this thing here, 1913. What in the world was going on? So we see this culmination of history. And moving forward, 1909 was when the 16th Amendment was getting kicked off and it was going through. It was first put in by the Democrats, and they said, no, we can't get this through. So it got through and ratified within the context of the Republicans in that in 1913. 17th Amendment, wow. You know the 17th Amendment movement, where it started? Your neighbor to the south of here, Oregon. When you look into the history of the 17th Amendment, Oregon was one of the first places that they were saying, you know what, we're going to start taking in this progressive movement that was going on at that period of time. We're going to take and we're going to say that we need to have a popular election. And we're not worried about states' rights or anything like that. So, what happened then is that through the 16th, people got, are being directly taxed. And what we're seeing is that frame's starting to get punched out. Wow. Wow. Then what we see with the ratification in the 17th in total is that a lot of troubles. Karl Marx, right? 1848. Interesting. 1848. Wow. Did you know there was a fellow by the name of Henry George? Anybody hear of Henry George? He was in that same period, just a little bit later. And some of the things he did was about property taxes and land rights and all of that. And he wanted to see that the property was all owned by the government and that you would rent the property and pay rent on it and all of that. It was real interesting that he didn't get anywhere, so he went over to England. And, geez, what happens in England? Do you own the property over in England? No. Also in that period of time, well, when did the Fabian Socialists really form as an organization? About 84. So 1884. So you see all these different movements that were going on. Real interesting is that there were three major influencers during that period that moved into this early 1900s as well. A playwright and two authors. Does anybody have any idea who that might be? Shaw. George Bernard Shaw, who was one of the founders of the Fabians. Let's see. A woman by the name of Virginia Woolf, and then who was the third person? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Orwell. Correct. Absolutely. Wow! See the influences that happen in different areas? And we've heard these people, we've seen their writings and, read them as well. One of the interesting things that was happening is that, has anybody ever looked at this catechism on the Constitution? Very interesting. I've been studying this stuff for a day or two, and when I got introduced to this, I started going through it. I can do this. This is going to be, oops, I can't answer that question. I missed that one. And you start going through this thing and says, you know what? A fifth grader in 1829 was smarter, especially than those that are sitting in Congress today. That was, this was elementary. You can download that. You can find it on the internet. It's easy to find. You can look it up in the references. So anyway, with the 17th Amendment, we got all these problems, all these things that are going on. Wow, there's our senator, based on being, appointed by the legislature, standing on that wall, protecting what's supposed to be going on. He's protecting the states, is what they're doing. Wow, what happens? He's blown off the wall. Not only is he blown off the wall, we're starting to see what the heck is going on inside the Senate. Oh man, they're blowing a hole through the wall of the state. State legislators, they say, what's happening from the federal government perspective? What are we seeing? Then it's all about spend, 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 tax, tax, tax. We're seeing that all the time. Well, there it is, 17th Amendment. It keeps pounding that whole idea of what's going on out. Well, here's the nail in the coffin on that whole process here. This was something that came about that was really interesting. This was the Butler case. I don't know if anybody has studied that or understands the Butler case, but it goes back to the 32 Agricultural Act, where what they were trying to do was stabilize the economy. And it was government taking and determining pricing so that from an agricultural perspective they could stabilize what was happening in the economy. Well, this poor fellow, he's this farmer, he goes out there and he wants to take and set aside about 10, 20 acres for himself. And say, I'm going to grow this grain for myself and feed my family and my livestock and all of that. Government came in and said, no, your 20 acres is affecting the whole economy. You can't do that. We're going to fine you. Well, it went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court says, you know what, you really can't take and fine the guy for that, but you know what we're going to do? If you clean up the whole idea on how you're going to put legislation together, you can go ahead and tax them for anything. You can do whatever you want as long as you qualify in the bill what you want to do. You see? So that then takes and opens up the whole door of unlimited powers. And the Supreme Court authorized it. Wait a minute, how can that be? What's that argument? Well, you see, the court sided with Hamilton. Because there was this argument, you got to understand, who was the Federalists? John Jay wrote the Federalist Papers. Who? Hamilton and Madison. Well, Madison and Hamilton start getting in this tizzy about this whole thing on taxation and this whole idea of what? What is the general welfare? Do we hear that argument today? What's going on? What's the general welfare? How does that work? Well, they did. They argued it. Madison said it's in the confines of what? Those 20 limited powers. Hamilton said, no. You know what? We can take and we can look at that, necessary and proper clause. And that says, that's outside those 20 general powers. And that means, we could do these things. We could do that. And in the Butler case in particular, the Supreme Court sided with the Hamilton definition of what was going on. So that took and it knocked that wall further out in its perspective on that legislative idea of what's going on with the legislature. Wow, that was interesting. We had this great framework around this Constitution and how it should work. Okay. So what we had is that whole single wall now knocked out. Wow. And then this one I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because there's more of you out there that know a whole lot more about it than I do. Federal Reserve. When that came into play, that then took and what? Congress gave up its whole rights to how it was going to manage our economy, how it was going to manage our money system. Well, enough to be said on that. I didn't know about this until I really started digging deep and hard. This whole idea, again, of Madison arguing in this anti-administration party. If you would, look at the date again. 1790, 1792. You know, taking you back again a little bit. But these arguments started early on. I mean, that's simple math now. I can go from 89 to 91, 90, let's see, 1 year, 2 year, 3 years. Okay, I could do that on one hand. But it got down to that same argument on what was going on with how you take and not only are you going to establish the bank and fund the government, but also then, wait a minute, we're getting once again down here, necessary and proper clause. What did that mean? Very interesting. You see, the arguments and battles we're having today aren't new. I always tell people that I absolutely believe in what Ecclesiastes 1:9 says. Nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new under the sun. So what we're seeing then is that the Federal Reserve takes and knocks out that other wall. It just, we're seeing things happening. I have fun with this one, so we're going to go through this a little bit here, is that the 25th Amendment allows for a coup d'etat. Let's go back and take a look. Who was president in the 70 time period? Nixon. Nixon's first vice president, who was he? Agnew. What happened to him?
Resigned in disgrace.
He resigned in disgrace. What happened then? Nixon does what? Appoints whom? Ford. Ford's appointed. Okay, Congress has to say that's okay, we can appoint this guy. All right, you can do that, Nixon. What happens to Nixon? He resigns. Who becomes president? Ford. Was he elected? No. What does he do? No. Before that, he needs a vice president. What does he do? He appoints whom? Rockefeller. That strong, conservative guy. Oh, you don't think so? Oh, okay. So, yeah, Ford was questionable at best. But you see, even though Congress, and you have to go back and you have to look at who was in Congress, what was happening in Congress at the time, but how easy would it have been next? So we had an unelected president, an unelected vice president, and if something happened to Ford, you would have Rockefeller, and before wow! So it's fun to say, it's fun to, it's interesting, but you have to understand that Congress has to approve. You didn't get to approve it. Well, wait a minute. You elected representatives who are under the Republican form of government should represent you in a way that they know you very well. So Miss McMorris Rogers comes and visits you all the time and really understands your thought process, your heart, your intent, and the true needs of your area. And so then she can take and make sure that the right person gets appointed. Oh, I'm sorry. But you see, it's interesting. It's interesting. Why do we have what we have? Wow. So when we start seeing is that the Supreme Court all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, it starts doing all sorts of stuff. Early on, folks, early on. It starts expanding its judicial authority over a period of time. One case that I'm not going to get into a lot of detail of, but I'll tell you, when you really study this out, everybody hears of Mayberry and wait a minute, Mayberry, is that it? Wasn't that a town someplace? Marbury and Madison. So this was happening when John Adams, a strong Federalist, this was midnight appointments. He was packing the courts. He was packing all of the lower courts that were out there, and he was signing these writs of appointment. Who was John Adams' Secretary of State? Does anybody know? John Marshall. John Jay, when there became a vacancy for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Adams offered it to John Jay. John Jay goes, I don't think so. The court isn't where I think it should be. I'm going to say no. Well, you know who ended up as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court? Marshall. So, what we have here is that according to from a constitutional perspective and the job descriptions from that of an administrative perspective for the Secretary of State from an administrative perspective, it was Marshall's job to make sure that Mr. Marbury got his appointment. He didn't do that. So when Jefferson gets elected and you have Madison becoming his Secretary of State, Jefferson's going, wait a minute, these are midnight appointments. I don't think they're appropriate. I don't think we have to execute them. So guess what? Now you have Marbury and Madison. And who was the Chief Justice that then adjudicated the case? Marshall. So the guy that was supposed to make the appointments adjudicates the case and tells Madison he has to do this. But worse than that, he looked at it from that whole perspective of, oh, wait a minute, we're going to start reviewing law. The Supreme Court is going to take and look at this. So he started opening up a lot of different places for the Supreme Court to go over a period of time. So there was a lot of things that even Jefferson had to say, and you can look at the notes. They're going to be in the video, or they are on the video. And the arguments and the letters that he did to John Adams on this whole thing. It was real interesting. But you know what? What it did is it started to knock out that other framework. Knocked out that other framework. The courts started to run away. Ladies and gentlemen, treaties. I want to get into this, just this brief introduction here. But what's clear from even those founders' perspective, treaties don't change the Constitution. But as we saw earlier, they do what? They become the supreme law of the land. They become the supreme law of the land. So what's happening here is that whole last frame that we're going to look at gets knocked out because of the idea, not just of executive orders. Those become, until the 20th century, are somewhat inconsequential. They were just telling the administration how they needed to function and operate, and it wasn't, what it is today. The one that we're going to concentrate on a little bit more is this whole idea of these international executive agreements. With the executive orders, they were validated by the court. They were said they were fine. There were a number of different things that came into question. For instance, the internment of the Japanese Americans during the Second World War and all of that. But one that I thought was really fun and interesting was this whole idea of this Mr. Avery. He was the chairman of the board of Montgomery Ward. And during the war effort, the whole idea is that, if you were in manufacturing or you were doing different things, that your company had to do what the government told you to do for the war effort. Well, interestingly enough, at this period of time, what was happening with Montgomery Ward was the idea is that a labor union wanted to unionize all of the Montgomery Ward stores. Avery was saying, I ain't doing that. There's no way on this planet. And he told Roosevelt straight up, forget it. Roosevelt did an executive order and had Avery physically removed from his offices, and took over Montgomery Ward's books and put in their own person. There's a bunch of us in this room, I believe, served in the military. And we were always trying to figure out At least I was, because of some of the interesting things that I had a life cycle to do. When do you countermand an order? Unfortunately, you have some smiling guys here thinking they're doing the right thing for the wrong reason. You see, they think that they were supporting that war effort. So it's always interesting, especially of us that have served, or those that are serving now, is to understand, what do the orders, what do they make sense? But worse was this guy, he was the Attorney General under Roosevelt. Now, you've never heard this statement whatsoever before, but this was the first time it was said. You know what? The federal government can do anything it wants to do if it's not enumerated in the Constitution. Wow! Attorney General of the United States. You haven't heard anything like that before, have you? Recently? Okay. So with all of this that was going on, guess what? There was a guy in 44 that came up and said, you know what? This is nonsense. We have to have a Liberty Amendment. So his whole idea of Liberty Amendment or amending isn't new. There was one that was out there in 44. Wow. International executive agreements. A lot of these definitions you can go are easy to find and understand right out of State Department website. The whole idea of it is that although Congress may give loose definition to certain things, in essence, the Secretary of State and the President can take and enter into an agreement that becomes the law of the land without ratification of the Senate. That's the gist of it. So we see a lot of different things that have happened over time that we're living in today. For example, I like to note that as Agenda 21 actually came in, and this whole sustainability and what we're suffering under all of that, fundamentally came in from that point of view. You see, it wasn't, Agenda 21 was signed off by who? Bush number 1. He signed it. Did it get ratified? No. But what happened was then Clinton implemented it through executive order. You can go and you can, those that know about Agenda 21, you can do the research and you can see that. And you can even see on the YouTube of Nancy Pelosi then agreeing from the idea on the House floor saying, we have to fund this Agenda 21. So we're seeing Congress then financially giving consent to an executive agreement or treaty without going through a ratification process, and a consenting process of the Senate. This is interesting. It's egregious. It's a lot of what we're experiencing in many different ways, and we've seen it not only under this administration, but we've even seen it under Republican administrations, that there's a lot out there. There's a lot out there to the extent that there's 489 pages, okay, in the State Department report on treaties, over 10,000 entanglements. George Washington in his farewell address said what? Avoid entanglements. Avoid entanglements. There's, in most of these, I started to write a paper on it and I was overwhelmed and I said, you know what, I'll go do something else for a few days. But you start putting the financial wraparound on these 10,000 treaties and agreements. You know, when we had a government shutdown, what did not get shut down? Funding these treaties and agreements. None of that got shut down. The funding continued. Well, that takes us to our favorite topic. Anybody ever hear the song Hotel California? You can get in, but you can't get out. Well, see, that's what the UN is. Everybody says, get out of the UN, get out of the UN. You can't. We cannot get out. In the UN Charter, it's very clear that once someone enters in, the only way out is they kick you out. Well, if you're the sugar daddy, they ain't going to kick you out, brother. So that's the whole idea. And what's really, really interesting, it's a constituent treaty. So it has a different effect in law. And to the extent what it says is what? That it prevails over every other treaty. See, it was really... Who was that communist that helped craft? Yeah. So we're seeing that, wow, that was really interesting. And that was what the governments of the people. Look, I don't know that my grandfather said anything about taking and okaying that, but he trusted our representatives. We didn't have what Adams was talking about, that watchful eye. They didn't know. There was a trust factor. Wow. Interesting stuff. We need to have those watchful eyes. Oh, and then you have your international courts on top of that. Very interesting, I think it was a week ago now, is that Egypt, the International Criminal Court has been trying to touch you and me for a lot of years. Every other president to date has said, no way. When Obama was first elected and that issue was brought up on the International Court again, he says, you know what, we're going to take another look at this. There's a case now going to the Supreme Court that is over a woman who assaulted her ex-husband, I believe it was, or boyfriend, with chemicals out of her kitchen sink, and now they want to apply the International Criminal Court against her for using chemical weapons in assaulting this individual. Whoa! Interesting. So that's going up to the Supreme Court right now on how to apply the ICC to the individual. Well, the funny thing that happened about 2 weeks ago is that Egypt filed a case with the ICC against Obama for taking and colluding with the Muslim Brotherhood for the overthrow of the regime and funding them and participating. So I wonder how that's going to fly. You know, is the goose going to what's good for the goose is good for the gander? Is the old adage? So it's interesting what that's all about. But the UN, the interesting thing is that the UN treaty, with the UN treaty, and most of our other treaties are within the context of the UN. So it gets real interesting as to, wow, they take major precedent and effect. No wonder we have all of these things going on. There goes that executive branch. That nice framing sure is changing. What in the world is going on? Oh, and on top of that, I solemnly swear to do what?
Support and defend the Constitution.
Roger that. As it is. As it is. So when we tell all of these elected representatives, stand on the Constitution, what do we give them? What do we allow?
What's the solution?
There it is. The frame's punched out. Wow. What did Washington say in his farewell address? Security, property. Interesting. When you take the religious obligation out of the oath, what does it mean? Why even bother taking an oath? What's going on with that? So what we now have is with these expanded frames that have happened through all of these processes, we're seeing that initial context shrink. And now we have over 250 agencies with 2,600 committees making regulations, taking and looking at taxing, spending, all of this, and at top of it all, we have what? Wow. It's overwhelming. You know, de Tocqueville talked about this. He walked us down that road of thought and talking about the soft despotism, a new type of tyranny. You know, it's mild, it's gentle, it's going to bring you along, it's going to take and it's going to keep you in that perpetual childhood. It's going to take care of you. It's going to support you. It's going to check and see how your happy index is. Yeah. Venezuela, they just brought a guy in that's the minister over happiness. Interesting. Yeah. No, I'm not joking. I spent a lot of time in Venezuela. Let me tell you, it was an interesting place, especially under Chavez. One of the things he drills it down to is that it touches every aspect of your life, and that the principles of equality. Listen to that. This is de Tocqueville was writing this. The principles of equality taken to what? Where is that? Principles of equality. They have prepared man for this. What did he talk about earlier in equality relative to democracy versus socialism? Oh my goodness. We're just cruising right along. You know what? How did we get there? They said, we love you. This is our elected officials. We'll take care of you. But what they do? They load us up with all this stuff. Oh my goodness gracious. I'll tell you what. You know what? We have a runaway government that's got to be stopped.
Yeah.
And we can do it. We can do it. Okay? You got to get the control back in the people. It says, this Constitution says, we the people. So it has to come back to what we the people do. What are we going to do about it? You know what? We have to revive the love of liberty. It has to come back. It has to come back from that whole perspective of what our founders did. That great first awakening. What has to happen within the context of the churches. The first great awakening didn't happen out there. Some people are saying if you from a church background, is that, we got to have revival, we got to have revival. No, they have to have reformation inside the churches and get the pastors and especially the leadership to get off their butts and understand that it goes back to a covenant relationship and work their way through this whole process to understand they need to be participating in our government again. De Tocqueville talked about this again on every citizen. You get that elementary knowledge, that understanding of what it's all about. We have to have these doctrines that they're put inside of us. They're evidence. They're of a religious perspective and of history. Samuel Adams, I just always have been impressed with him. That's why he's my alter ego. When the Declaration of Independence, he did speak for 5 hours. His speech was a 5-hour-long speech. But he talked about this whole idea that we're returning now everything back to the sovereign. He understood that. He just looked at that from that whole perspective. One of the other things that he said in this whole idea, and he did this when he was writing a letter to his cousin John, and John was at that time Vice President of the United States. Some of the key things he was talking about was education. That we had to make sure that the boys and girls, because he was the first proponent in New England in particular, that girls would be educated the same as boys. And after he left his office as governor, he spent a lot of time in education. But the real point is that it has to be imbued into them an understanding of the deity, the understanding of these Christian principles. Because you know what? He said that the whole idea of knowledge without the context of God was nothing. It was meaningless. But the thing that caught me most about this, he says, all education is religion. So when you study education, Dewey being the first president of the American Humanist Society and all these other things, wow! That is something else. I mean, here's this guy way back in, what was this? 1790. He was writing this and he says, holy smokes, let's see, where is that? Oh, that all education is religious because it sets these principles into play. And then, it wasn't Reagan that talked about the next generation. Samuel Adams brought that out. How we educate the next generation is going to determine what type of government and all of that we're going to have in the future. Liberty, he wrote about again in 1748. If you go out and Google and look up the whole thing on liberty and sedition, I pulled out a few key points. But he talks about, yes, there is liberty. It's about liberty. Oh, yes, there is liberty. And we have to solidify under that. We have so many things that are happening in the liberty movement, the Tea Party movement, whatever you want to call it, the conservative movement, that they end up tearing us apart. You know what? One of the things that I talk about from Samuel Adams' perspective, he understood banking. He understood attacks. They understood all the things we are going through today. Without question. They understood them. And to the extent that you look at what coalesced everyone and brought all those issues together was the idea of liberty. It's about liberty. We have to bring the movement back under that whole context and understanding of what is liberty and what do we do. You know, if we pull together on all of that, we're going to see this wall rebuilt. We're going to see that when we start bringing all of these individual ideas, problems, and issues back under the context of liberty, we're going to heal the nation. We're going to heal the Constitution. We're going to make it work again. Excuse me. So in healing the Constitution, it can't be the shotgun effect we've been doing, folks. I've been, when I got out of the military around 84-ish, and I keep hearing the promises, we just got to elect the electable. Guess what? Let's see, 85, okay, I got that math problem thing going on. That's a long time. I haven't seen it work yet. You know where I have seen it work, though? Is in local government and in state government. And until we understand that we have to affect that in the local and state governments, then we can deal with the national. We have to return the power to the states. Now, this is where I'm going to excite some of you, but bear with me. We have to repeal the 17th Amendment, and we can do it. You know why we can do that? Because the enemy has already done the research for us. It's very, very interesting. When you take and you look at this, at the 100th anniversary of the 17th Amendment, that these two people, this Wendy Schiller and this Charles Stewart, she was from Brown University, or still is at Brown University, and he's at MIT. Wait a minute. Brown University, MIT. Geez, they're real conservative schools. Well, you know what? They were funded by none other than Brookings Institute. That's a real conservative place, right? This report alone indicates that the Senate is no better off today than what it was prior to the 17th Amendment in 1913. As a matter of fact, the research shows it's worse off. We have more corruption, we have more petty insanities, and we have more bad elections of senators than what it was when the states were appointing them and then had their states' rights secured. Very interesting. They're saying it, not me, so they're the enemy is already taking and doing our homework. You know what was real interesting? They did another research paper paid by you, the taxpayer, through the National Science Foundation that did a absolute voting record, what bills were happening, all of the very, very interesting research that they did. And one of the conclusions that they came out of at this period of time, and again, this report was concluded in 2008, that at that time, that the majority of the states' senates were held in the state legislatures were held in Republican hands to the extent that the Senate would be 52, if not 53, senators would be of a Republican nature. Now, I'm not saying that all Republicans are great, but I'm just saying that if you look at that versus popular election and returning it back to a states' rights perspective, very interesting statistics. So I challenge you to think through the process, to think through that idea that if there was one place that we could return this nation back to a constitutional balance, It would be repealing the 17th Amendment. They already did the homework. We don't have to do the research. We just have to come together and have our legislators look at that and encourage them to do something about it. I talk about amending to restore just from the whole idea that, the Liberty Amendment, as we saw in 44, has been around for a long time. I've read our talk show host's book, The Liberty Amendments. I've gone through them in detail. I looked at them. They're extremely interesting. And I think there's a lot of credence to what he has to say in the majority of them. But if you go and Google just the Liberty Amendment from 1975, that movement has been on track and happening for a good number of years. Which then repeals, as I said, the 16th and all of that. Also, I think we need to look as the anti-federalists, and even from the very beginning, and we've seen, is that there needs to be something done with the judiciary.
Yeah.
I've had interactions with Antonio Scalia. I think he's a great guy. But a couple of years ago, he did a real interesting conversation. He's done it. You can go Google some of the things that he said. But what took me aback was that he said, from a constructionist perspective, you know what? Going forward, we can't keep putting up with this silliness, this nonsense. We have to, stand firm on a strict constructionist perspective. But you know what? Let's not worry about the past. Let's not worry about what was already done. I went, ooh, my friend, what are you saying? That's a bunch of stuff that has to be fixed, from a Supreme Court perspective. So, as much as that goes, I think we need to make some changes there as well. Fourth, we need to pass something restricting the out-of-control executive. I mean, that's very clear, especially on the international executive agreements. We have to have something more solid put in place on a checks and balance perspective, because they're killing us. They're just wiping us out. When you go look at what I said, those 498 pages, over 10,000 entanglements, Congress hasn't done anything about it. Electing new people in hasn't done anything about it. They just keep doing it. Then I look at one that a lot of people don't look at, because I have this real heartburn with the 14th Amendment and how it's been used and overlays into a lot of things. So we need to look at some of the misconstructions and misconstrued aspects of things relating to the 14th. If we start doing some of this stuff, I think what we'll see is that framework starts to come back together again. Repeal the 17th, we do these different things, we look at judicial reform and all of that. We've looked at them from a legislative perspective, but they've never gone anywhere. And half the reforms that were done and gone through the electorate and through the process were weak and ineffective. Well, so if we heal the Constitution, what it might look like is, returning it back to its original framing, all the way through the ideas of maybe, an additional 28 through 34 amendments. It's something to think about, something to consider. You know why? Because we want to give the controls back where they belong, back to the people. We want to see it as that Constitution as it was. This was interesting. Daniel Webster said, you grant liberty only to those who love it and always ready to guard it and defend it. And that's what I believe we want to do. That's why we're here. That's why we're talking through these things. Oh, let's do a fact check. Hold on. Time out. This whole thing about amendment. What are you, crazy? I've got good friends in a number of different organizations say, you're nuts on this amending thing. Whoa, look at these. Ever since the foundation, look at the ideas and the numbers of amendments that were brought forward. Granted, we only have 27, but that goes back to what the founders intended, that it would be a difficult process, that it would not be easy to do. But something? The thing that most impressed me was that there were 2 times that constitutional conventions were called. They didn't get anywhere. But you know what they did do? They were a strategic move of the people through their state legislators to take and force the hand of Congress to change things. The first one was in the 60s, where we were looking at what was happening with reapportionment. Very interesting what was going on there with reapportionment. The second time was in the 70s/80s with the balanced budget amendment idea. They never got passed. But during that time frame, we saw legislation that forced the hand of Congress and the President to do some things that changed how our economy shifted, what was going on in a number of different ways. So it's interesting to entertain these ideas. One of the things that I do want to note in here from a reference perspective is this report right out of from the Senate. Or is that the one from the Senate? Yeah, you can go on there and look. And there's also another I have noted up on the website is out of Harvard Law School, out of one of their analysis on the amendment process and how it should be done, how it could be done, and what its effects could be. So I think that it's very, very interesting that if that's something that you are wanting to understand as you hear all this hoopla about a convention of the states, you need to do your homework and truly understand the effects and how something can be done safely and properly and not have a runaway convention if certain parameters are put in space. And I'm not going to get into all of that. I can't leave you, nor should I, nor should anyone ever leave you without action items. You got to do something. You know, you can sit here and go, you know what, all he said, malarkey. Well, you can go look at the references yourself. You can say here, that was great information. I have to go ponder it. But really, it's about what are you going to do with what you already know and what you may have gained today. I always go back to the Declaration of Independence. You know, the Declaration was what set our foundation. It's what gave us the ideas to become the nation that we became. You know, I look at sacred honor as that first action item. Under that, I take into that is that focusing on liberty. You've heard me expound on that to some degree, as our founders did. It has to be that unifying idea that brings all of these other things that we're chasing after together. Yes, we have to have passion for all these other things, but if those other things are not taking and driving us back to the ideals of liberty, what good are they? They become one-issue things. One-issue things. With that is the whole idea, as I mentioned before. It has to get back to the church's pastors, and where, from my experience and ideas, it's been problematic. I could talk to pastors that want to be black robes and pray. There's a priest down in Phoenix area that I met he preaches from his pulpit. Amazing, you know, and a lot of the founders had problems with the Catholics, but at the same time, there's this one priest down there, he's fantastic, and two rabbis I know in the Phoenix area, as well as I know a lot of rabbis out on the East Coast. Fantastic. They're about liberty. They're about restoring what we have. The block, a lot of times, is, you know, the other guys on the board. So, you know, we have to work within the context and the frameworks of our churches and synagogues to help bring that liberty message back into understanding and play. You know, build a Liberty Coalition. Washington State's doing a great job of that. You know, we hear it. I've seen it. I've seen things happening on the west side. Ohio, in the state of Ohio, the Liberty Coalition that's happening there is phenomenal. Being extremely effective. Here's a strange place for you that is working really well. Long Island, New York. Yeah. They are forming and have formed the Liberty Coalition. There's one Tea Party group up there, CSA, 15,000 members. And in that 15,000, at a meeting will show up 300 to 500. And then they're working together with all the different tea parties. I went to a lot of tea parties from Queens all the way up to, what's that fancy place called up there? Hamptons? Yeah. Believe it or not, in Southampton, there's a tea party that I spoke at up there. Amazing. If you could do that in New York, wow, what more can we do here? Even in communist Seattle, maybe. Did I say that? All right. Here's the interesting piece. Get more people to understand what we're talking about. I know you're doing that. I know you're doing that. But that's what it really gets down to, is they have to understand the liberty message. So a lot of times you talk to them just about politics. It's politics. Who cares about politics? What about your liberty? There's those that are working on coalitions here about personal property rights. We see things that are happening from a taxation perspective that people don't understand about private-public partnerships and what that costs. Wait a minute, that's a property right issue. Let's take a look at that. The whole idea of then what is the dilemma, citizens understanding the dilemma. Educate, you're doing that. Many people have been through the classes, and then what I would challenge you again, as I mentioned earlier, understand the Fifth Amendment. What is the Constitution of States information? There's a great website, a group that's been out here. I think Mark Meckler has spoken to a group around here before. But it is, you can go out and Google it on the Constitution of States. And their handbook is one of the best things I've seen on understanding it, at least getting a perspective so you know why you want to argue either way on the whole issue. Excuse me. Oh, there it is, the Harvard Journal. That's the one that I was talking about. Really good information on Constitutional Convention and the Fifth Amendment. Lives. What are we doing with our lives? How does that work? What's happening with that? For the last 10 years, I have this silly mantra: butts out of the seats and feet in the streets. How many people here are PCOs? You're elected, right? You are the first elected official that your constituents see. It's not like it was in New England at the early days of the formation of our country, where the community got together out there by the Liberty Tree and chose the representative to then go to the House. No, what it was is you, the PCO, are the first elected official that your neighborhood person is going to see. It's not just about getting in there at PCO meetings and voting for whatever and listening to all the hoopla. It's about meeting your neighbor. We don't do that anymore. Wayne Perryman, some of you may know him from over out of Seattle. Man, he's a fantastic patriot. He and his sons wrote a book about 5-6 years ago called "Where Have All the Porches Gone?" Where I grew up in, northern Ohio, we had porches. People say out there. I tell people, where I lived in Cleveland, there was even cobblestone streets, and the horse and wagon would come by, and the guy would pick up the rags and all of that type of stuff. Oh, do I look that old? But that was still happening when I was young. I remember that stuff. Wow. So, interesting. Meet our neighbors. You'll be amazed that they'll engage you in conversations if you ask them, what's going on with your liberty? What do you mean? How's that go? Well, here's some of the things that are happening in our community. Here's what's going to affect your property rights. Are you interested? If they're not, fine. But then you go on. Constitutional candidates. We have to support them. We have to vet them. It's not about the electable. It's who's going to represent us on principle. And if they don't understand our foundational principles, you're going to get the same stuff we've been getting for the last 30 plus years. Our fortunes, you're doing that. And I hope you're doing that. You know, we ask donation bucket, help out. We have great patriots that are really doing something for you to be here. Also, one of the things that I always look at, and it's a very difficult and touchy subject to me, is you got to pay for some education sometimes. There's a really great group that is doing some work on citizenship. And, man, there's things that I've seen happen here in Washington. I tell people wherever I go, I find that a lot of stuff that's happening in Washington State is leading. I've seen leadership and citizenship in this state that is examples for other places. And I tell people about that. And it's interesting. We're seeing more and more of that. But there is an outfit out of Tennessee that is doing a great class on citizenship. And what we've been seeing done, good, you guys have been to them? Outstanding. What we've seen done, or what I've seen and participated and did over the last 30 plus years, they put it in a book so you can learn it. Wow! I think that's great. And they make you do homework. So if you don't like doing the homework, don't take the class. No, you better take the class so you can learn how to do the homework. You know? Here's a tough one. Personal time. You see what the enemy does extremely well. You guys don't know this. I know you don't know the answer to this one. I use this example all the time too. Patty Murray. What was she before she became a U.S. Senator? She was a teacher. She came in through the education. What did the Democratic Party do? Mentored her. They saw something in her that they could raise up into their principles to the extent that she's number 2 in the Senate. You know what? In all the years that I participated in the Republican Party, never once have I seen a mentorship of that next generation of leaders. We get a few here and there. And you know what? I love the Leadership Institute out of D.C. I spent time in D.C. last summer and went down there a few times. But one of the things that really jerked my chain was when I got an email saying, here's the things we're doing so that you can take and expand and extend your political career. I'm sorry, it's not a career. You know, the Anti-Federalists said is that we have to return them back, as I said earlier, we have to return them back to who they were, to being a citizen so that they understand whence they came from. You know? And so it's not a career. But we have to mentor and raise up in constitutional principles. And that takes time. That takes time finding someone in the crowd. You know, we have some young people in this crowd. I think there may be some even under 30s in this crowd today. You know, as I watch people walk in. Grab a hold of them, folks. We who are mature and understand these principles need to help them understand them to the extent that they can be the next constitutionally principled leaders. I said that. There's references, and they go on. And again, they're on the website. So with that, I've taken a lot of your time this evening, and I thank you for indulging me in what I've been able to present and being here. And I hope it has been helpful that you can get the butts out of the street and the feet on the butts out of the seats and the feet on the street. So thank you very much. Open for some questions, if you want.
I think questions are great. I also would like you to, I was going to do this, but I do want you guys to know back on the table, there is a presentation with the references as well as just the audio of the presentation that you can pick up. But I'm sure that you probably do have questions, so and I need your help, guys. There's food on that back table. And if I have to take it home, that means John and I have to eat it. And that's just really not a good thing. So please.
And I'm their house guest, so if I have to eat it, we're really.
Well, there's a lot. There's banana bread, pumpkin bread, little goodies back there. So please gobble it up, and let's do some questions. Victoria.
Thank you very, very much. You were very excellent.
Wait for a microphone so everybody can hear you. Okay.
I wanted to say thank you very much. I'm dead tired, but you were great to listen to. I really appreciate it. Do you have this whole conversation and the screen on a DVD that we can purchase?
Yeah, and John is doing this particular one. So the one that is back there that you can purchase has all but a couple slides in there. And because I wanted to draw the audio off of it, I actually read all of the Tocqueville stuff and some of that. So yes, the DVD has 98% of what I just showed you today, and
the speaking
yes,
at the same time?
Yes, and the slides of that presentation that I did a couple months ago, and so all of that's there on the DVD.
Thank you.
Somebody just dropped this, so don't go too far because they're your keys and dog tag and all that kind of stuff. Other questions?
Great.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Cool. Anybody else?
When are you going to be making another presentation similar to this? And was it okay if I brought my camera to upload it to YouTube?
The next presentation is in Deer Valley, Arizona. That's Friday. So I'm leaving here early Thursday morning. I have a Samuel Adams event that I'm doing tomorrow night, and then leaving Thursday morning and going back. So when I get invited back to this area, I would be delighted. And so look at the website, get one of the cards, look at the calendar, and see when I'm going to be back up in Washington, Idaho.
Yeah, I want to thank you for coming by tonight, and I know this is probably way beyond the scope of what's possible to answer. It's not a 25-word or less answer, I'm sure, but having witnessed firsthand what happens, when state conventions come together, this idea of coming together with constitutional conventions. I've watched how the powers that be manipulate those meetings just unrecognizably. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of fear, I think, out there, I think rightfully so, about what could happen if you open up the process. We have something way worse at the end of it. What can you say about that?
Easy.
Okay.
And so what I commented on Convention of the States website, so the handbook, and Madison talked about this because he was challenged, and that was part of the challenges, what Patrick Henry said as well as others. Who gave you the right to take and construct this whole new government? And what Madison came back with is, to the extent that the resolve that came out of the Maryland Conference, as well as the way that the resolution that came out of Congress itself in '87 gave the open authority to do that. So when we look at the Convention of the States, so what the founders gave us in understanding what happened, and they argued it pretty hard when you not only look at Madison's notes, but also when you look at Yates and a number of the others, that section there, and how do you fix what's broke, if you will, how do you mend this thing, was quite a contentious discussion. So from Madison's description, and then what the Convention of States idea and principles are, you can pick one thing. And as long as the states are coming in unison, and the state legislatures, and that's why they're working with the state legislatures versus of taking it to Congress and allowing Congress to put the resolution and determine what it should look like. You can take in and you can set those rules of the convention based on what the states are already looking at. You can pick one item. Is it the 17th? Is it the 16th? Is it one thing? And as long as there is unanimity in choosing that direction of that article that is going to be addressed, that's doable. And the Harvard article also, goes through that in detail. It looks at, who has the authority to set the convention rules and all of that. And there's equal argument within the context of the states as much as it is an argument of Congress itself. So there is that research and those things that you can look at, and it can be a limited convention, but it has to be agreeable. And that's why the work is done at the work is being done at the state legislature level right now. And there was a meeting on December 7th back. Many people may have heard of it, but there was a meeting of a number of legislatures from the various states that have already passed state legislation for a limited convention. They met December 7th back at Mount Vernon. Now, I haven't heard the results of that yet because I haven't talked to the various legislatures that have been there, but I hope to do that, and I will do that when I get back. Does that help?
Tom, I thought you did a great job of outlining the corruption of our Constitution and how far we have come from the original intent of the founders. I thought that there was an area, though, that I would like to see you cover a little bit more intently, and that's how you get a Congress that has gone its own way to respect and obey and support the Constitution. How can we in any way expect the Congress and the President to obey those new amendments if they disrespect and don't obey what's currently in place? A plain reading of the Constitution, comparing that to what we have today, tells me, just as a regular citizen, that Congress is going their own way, and it is a runaway Congress. In addition, the states only request Congress to make a call, and it was Congress who would make the call and set the rules. It is Congress who, on my counting, I count maybe 5 or 10 constitutional conservatives in Congress right now, whereas I see 70 or 80 progressive socialists in Congress who would be establishing and who hold seats of power in Congress, who would be establishing those rules. And we have, on top of that, a very liberal media who would throw everything they have at corrupting the convention process. So we don't have the same level playing field as we had in that miraculous collection of founders who came together at the same time.
And so the Institute for Self-Governance, what they look at is the 3%. And so when you start taking and we've seen it happen, and I'll give the example, Clark County, Washington. I don't know if you guys have been hearing what's going on over in Clark County. Okay? And what happened? That was a Liberty Coalition that came together. I know every one of those folks extremely well. And that, to me, is one of the most effective actions that happened, in the state of Washington, is what happened down in Clark County. So, and that was getting the feet on the street and communicating. The PCOs becoming active and going out and talking to their constituencies and everything like that. So it comes to the multi-parted action items, if you will. So if you go back and you review those action items, part of it is taking and finding these young people. Go to that table right there. Those young people right there, get a hold of them. Help them understand the principles that you and I believe in. Help them understand why is it important to have those framed constitutional principles, and that they can become the leaders in this next generation to replace those in Congress, so that if we amend and we are successful in that process, they'll be the ones executing it. And it came down to the same thing. It was the rule of 1/3. I tell this story. I said, okay, if you understand anything about the Bible, and you take and you start looking at what happened in the battle in heaven, how much of heaven went to hell? A third. So we have the battle of the thirds is not anything new. And then when it came down to those that started fighting the fight, it was only 3%. So the Center for Self-Governance, what they're looking at is even down to the 1%. And what effectiveness they've had in what they've been doing in Tennessee and how that's being replicated. So when we get down to how do we move, we have to take the local back. You know, I tell people that the enemy even took over the water district. You know, they got the water district, they got the sewer districts, they got all these different things, the school boards, that to your point, you know, we let them have.
Even the cemetery commission.
Cemetery division, all of it. So it comes back down to self-governance starts with me. I'm not even going to point at you. See, self-governance starts with me. And then how I become active within the context of that and how I get you to go with me. Because you see, society forms when you and I agree that we're going to protect that which is precious to us. And when we get people to understand that that's the formation of society, then we start saying, okay, we have some like-mindedness. And we have to find those areas of that like-mindedness to move forward with. And then we find that 3%. And that 3% then we take and we ignite, as Samuel Adams said, what? The brush fires of the mind. It wasn't brush fires of the battlefield. That came because people's minds got ignited with the brush fire of liberty. But it comes down to raising up that generation, mentoring them in those truths. And then when we have, because the amendment process isn't an overnight thing. It takes a long time. That's why a lot of the pre-work is being done. You know, Meckler's out there doing a pretty darn good job of building some stuff in the states to talk to the state legislators and get them, you know, active and understanding the process. But then it's going to take the support of the grassroots. So the name of your group, the Northwest Grassroots, right? That's what it takes. And grassroots is what it's going to. So those are parts of it. It's not the total answer, but that is the stepping stones on executing what we have to do. And it doesn't take millions. When you take 3% of 300 million, what do you got? You know, we have a formidable movement.
Got a couple other questions here, but I do want to ask you guys, I have a couple more address slips here. Do drop Tina a line and let her know that she made a difference with all the contributions that she's given. And this gentleman here has a question.
Regarding congressional pensions, can you how they came to be? And there's talk about term limits. What would the role of rescinding those pensions do to help move people in and out of Congress faster?
Well, you know, that was something they created for themselves. I don't remember when, you know, but so I can't put a date on it. But they were never to be pensioned for life. That was never the intent. As a matter of fact, during the original convention, it was argued whether they should get paid at all. And you know, so that was, you know, all part of it. To me, I'm all for, you know, them taking and not having pensions for life. Absolutely. Not they need to live under the same rules that we do. They're citizens first. We just happen to elect them to represent us. And if they think they're special privilege, now we have an aristocracy. And that's what it's become. And in the Senate, it's an oligarchy. So we're not under our framers' intent from that perspective. So that, yeah, if they would vote it away and you convince your legislature, get rid of it. I mean, there have been some that said they're donating their parts of their pensions or their salaries. You know, they come up with these other gimmicks. But the thing is that, you know, we got to put the pressure on them to say, no, you need to live just like everybody else, and it's not a career. The other thing on term limits, you know, I battle with myself on that whole thing on term limits, but as I keep going back and forth in what's happened in the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist papers, the whole idea was they were never intended to be in there for the long terms that they have been. Even Madison argued from the perspective that The only reason they went to 2 years was because there were several of the state legislatures that were at 2 years, because the majority of people in the states were only elected for 1 year. They had to go be reelected every year. And they thought for some continuity at the federal level that a 2-year period would give them at least that limited continuity within the House, because that's where the passions of the people were supposed to be exercised, as well as the whole idea that from bringing any type of bills requiring money, so that's where Obamacare is out of sync, because it started in the Senate instead of in the House, which there's Supreme Court cases going on that. But the idea is that these guys are supposed to be going home. They weren't supposed to be in office for a lifetime. And in the Senate, that was the same thing. It flipped over when the Senate was now electable and could be bought, by whomever, and money's outside of the state, whereas inside the state you had money problems with some, because you had some folks in the state legislature that would pick their own. But that becomes then the grassroots, ensuring that we're electing virtuous and moral people into office in a local area. So, term limits, from my perspective, we should be doing the term limits, but if we have to, then I'm not against the amendment anymore. I'm amending to set some term limits at the federal level.
Well, getting rid of the pensions might help.
And getting rid of pensions might help, but you know what? It's not about the money. It's what Samuel Adams and the others were saying. It's about the power. If you've not spent time in D.C., you come out of there, how do I describe it? You come out slimed. So if you ever saw that, what's
Ghostbusters.
that? Ghostbusters, right. You're slimed and you're heavy laden. You're burdened. I mean, the times that I've been in the D.C., there's great, if you look at just the history that's there, you have a great time. But if you have to go in there into the different dens of the beast, as I've done, you go, holy smokes. It's so the folks that get elected there, we send them there into this machine. They don't call the Beltway bandits for nothing. They're not called Beltway bandits for nothing. They're out there after our money. They're out there to put people who will play the power to keep us in the servitude that the Tocqueville talks about, in that soft tyranny and despotism. So, it's interesting.
Okay, well, I think it's probably time to wrap it up, unless there's one last comment. So let's just give one more appreciative hand here for Tom. I really enjoyed this evening. Thank you.